The reception hall at the Riverside Club in Charleston, South Carolina, seated 240 people and smelled like white roses and the specific anxiety of a room full of people who have been told to have a good time. I was standing in the parking lot when the door opened and the music came out briefly and then was swallowed back inside. I had been in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I had been asked to leave the reception 40 minutes earlier by my mother, who had done it quietly and with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been planning the sentence for longer than she would admit. I was still in my dress uniform. I had not yet decided what I was going to do next. Then the door opened again, and a man I had never met looked directly at me across the parking lot and said, "Captain Aldridge, is that you?" I want to tell you what happened after that. But to understand why that sentence changed everything, you need to know what the previous 10 years had been building toward. My name is Nora Aldridge. I am 36 years old. I am a captain in the United States Army, Military Intelligence Corps, currently assigned as a senior intelligence officer to the 525th Military Intelligence Brigade at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Before that assignment, I spent 14 months at a location I am not going to name doing work. I am not going to describe in detail, which is a sentence my family found embarrassing at dinner parties, and which I found completely normal, because it was the job. I have been in the Army for 13 years. I was commissioned through ROTC at the University of South Carolina in 2011, which is the same university my sister attended, in the same city where my family has lived for 30 years, and which is a coincidence of geography that I mention only because it means that every person at that wedding had the opportunity to know exactly who I was and exactly what I did for a living, and most of them had been told a different version instead. The first week of my first real assignment, a major named Dolores Wynn, who had been doing intelligence work for 22 years, sat across from me in a briefing room and said, without preamble, "The most important skill in this work is the ability to hold two contradictory pieces of information simultaneously and determine which one is true without letting your preference for one outcome contaminate the analysis." I wrote that down verbatim in my green notebook. I have applied it to every situation I have encountered professionally for 13 years. I applied it in that parking lot in Charleston, South Carolina, in my dress uniform, while the reception went on without me. Both things were true at once. My family had asked me to leave, and I was a captain in the United States Army with 13 years of service. The question was which truth was going to determine what happened next. I kept a small green notebook in the breast pocket of my ACS for the first 4 years of my career, the same kind I had used since the major gave me that first piece of advice. The habit stayed even after I moved into assignments where I could not write things down. I keep one on my nightstand now. The one from my first assignment is in a box in my apartment at Fort Bragg, with the major's sentence still legible on the first page in the handwriting of a 23-year-old who did not yet know how many times she would need it. I had no reason to think the wedding would be different from everything that had come before it. That was the problem. My sister's name is Claire. She is 32 years old, and she is the kind of person who has always known what kind of life she wanted and has organized everything around acquiring it. The life she wanted looked like the Riverside Club in Charleston, old money aesthetics, a social network built on the right schools and the right neighborhoods, and the right kind of professional success. The visible kind. The kind you could describe at a cocktail party without qualifications or security clearances. She was marrying a man named Davis Holcomb, whose family had been in Charleston for 4 generations, and whose mother had known our mother at the Junior League for 30 years. The wedding had been planned for 14 months. I had been asked to be a bridesmaid. I had said yes. I had bought the dress, which was a dusty rose color that I will not describe further, and worn it to the rehearsal dinner the night before, and smiled in photographs, and done everything that was asked of me. My mother's name is Patricia. She is 62 years old. She is a woman of genuine social intelligence and specific ambition, and I want to say that clearly because it is accurate. She is not a stupid woman. She is a woman who decided, sometime around my third year of active duty, that my career was a complication in a story she was trying to tell, and who had been quietly editing me out of that story ever since. Not with cruelty exactly, with omission. With the specific redirect that happens when you introduce someone at a party and then immediately change the subject before they can answer the follow-up question. With the careful substitution of underscore underscore quote underscore to underscore underscore for anything more specific, delivered in a tone that invited no further inquiry. I had noticed all of it. I had filed it and not acted on it, because the analysis always came back the same way. The relationship was worth more than the correction. I had been wrong about that for a long time. The summer my sister got engaged, I came home for a long weekend and sat in the kitchen with my mother while she showed me the wedding venue on her laptop. She was excited in the genuine way of a person doing the thing they are best at, and I sat across from her and drank coffee and asked questions and was present with her in the way I tried to be present whenever I was home, fully and without agenda. At one point she said, without looking up from the screen, quote 3, I said I understood. She said, quote 4, I said I had planned to wear the bridesmaid dress. She said good, and clicked to the next photo. I noted the sentence and what it meant and did not say anything further about it. I found out later that while I was sitting in that kitchen looking at venue photos, she had already sent an email to the wedding coordinator describing me as her daughter who worked in federal government and specifying that my military affiliation was not to be mentioned in the program or the toasts. I did not know about the email until the night before the wedding. The discovery happened at 11:40 on a Friday night, in the room I was sharing with my college roommate Becca, who had flown in from Portland and who has known me since we were 18, and who operates on the principle that honesty delivered with kindness is still honesty and should not be withheld. We were getting ready for bed. The rehearsal dinner had ended 2 hours earlier, and Becca handed me her phone with a specific expression. The expression of someone who has been deciding for several hours whether to show you something and has concluded that not showing you is worse. On the screen was a group text thread for the wedding party that I had not been added to. It had been running for 6 weeks. In it, my sister had described me, in response to a question from one of her bridesmaids about what to say if guests asked about me, as underscore underscore, quote underscore 5, underscore underscore. I read it once. I handed the phone back to Becca. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. The specific physical sensation was not anger, though that came later. It was something more precise. It was the sensation of a thing I had been analyzing with two contradictory datasets finally resolving into one clear picture. The way a map looks different when you finally identify the correct landmark and every other feature snaps into its proper position. I had been the black sheep. Not to my face, not in language that required a response, but in the running commentary of a family's private communication, in the version of me they presented to the world when I was not in the room. In 6 weeks of a group text I had not been invited to join. I set my phone face down on the nightstand. I said, I'm going to sleep. Becca said, Nora. I said, I know. I'll deal with it after I know the full picture. She said, okay. She turned off the light. I lay in the dark for about 40 minutes and did not sleep, and did not reach for my phone and did not do anything except think, which is what I do when I need to understand a situation before I respond to it. By the time I was done thinking, I had a clear assessment of what had happened, what was likely to happen the following day, and what I was prepared to do about it. The following day confirmed the assessment in almost every particular. The wedding ceremony was fine. I stood in the correct place and held my flowers and watched my sister marry Davis Holcomb in a church that smelled like lilies and old wood, and I was present for it, and it was genuinely moving in the way that weddings are when you set aside everything around them and look only at the two people in the center. I set aside everything around it. For that hour, I was just her sister. The reception was different. My mother found me 30 minutes into the cocktail hour. She was carrying a glass of champagne and wearing the expression she used for managing situations. She said she needed to speak with me privately. I followed her to a corridor off the main hall. She said that Davis's grandfather, a man named Colonel Retired Henry Holcomb, who had served in the army for 28 years and who was seated at the head table, had asked someone about me and had been told I was in the military, and that Davis's mother was concerned it would shift the focus of the evening. She said it in the reasonable tone of someone describing a logistical problem rather than the thing it actually was, which was a request for me to be smaller in a room I had every right to occupy. She said, "I think it would just be easier if you slipped out for a bit, just until after the toasts." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "You want me to leave my sister's wedding reception?" She said she just meant for an hour. I said, "I'll step outside." I walked to the coat check, retrieved nothing because I had nothing to retrieve, walked through the main doors and into the parking lot, and stood in the June heat in my bridesmaid dress and thought about the 11 pages I had written in a green notebook about my first year of service, and the major who had told me to hold two things at once and find what was true. I stood there for 11 minutes. Then the side door opened. That was the moment I need to tell you about. But I did not know yet what I had been holding in my hand the whole time, because the group text was not the full picture. What Becca found the next morning, while I was still in the parking lot, was going to rewrite everything I had understood about how long this version of me had been in circulation, and in how many rooms. Now I want to be clear about where I was at that point. I had been asked to leave a room by my mother, and I had gone because I was not yet ready to do otherwise. What I did not have yet was the complete inventory of what had been said about me, by whom, and to an audience that was significantly larger than a 6-person wedding party text thread. The thing I was about to find out would change the entire shape of the situation, because it would tell me that the person who had just walked out the side door and said my name and my title into the Charleston night had not done it by accident, and that what he knew about me he had not learned at that wedding. Becca called me at 12:14 in the morning from inside the reception. I was still in the parking lot. She said, "I need you to stay where you are and not do anything until I come out." I said I was not planning to do anything. She said, "I know, I'm coming out anyway." She came through the side door 4 minutes later with her phone and a glass of water she had brought for me without being asked, which is the kind of person she is. She handed me the water and showed me the phone. While I had been standing in the parking lot, Becca had done what she did professionally, which was research. She was a litigation paralegal in Portland, and she had the specific habit of mind that does not stop pulling a thread until she finds where it started. She had gone back through the wedding hashtag on social media, through the public posts from the wedding party and the guests over the previous 6 weeks, and she had found a pattern. My sister had posted about the wedding 11 times in 6 weeks. I appeared in none of the posts. Not in the bridesmaid announcement, not in the rehearsal dinner photo that included all 5 bridesmaids, which had been cropped to 4. Not in the caption of the getting ready photo taken that morning in the bridal suite, where I was visible at the edge of the frame, identified by name in the tags for every other person in the photograph and absent from mine. I looked at the cropped rehearsal dinner photo for a moment. I was familiar with the original because I was in it. Becca had found the original on another guest's public feed. She had placed them side by side on her screen. The crop was not incidental. It was precise. It removed me and no one else. I handed her phone back. I drank the water. I said, quote, 14. Becca said, quote, 15. I said, quote, 16. She looked at me. I said, quote, 17. She said she already had. She said, quote, 18. I said, quote, 19. She said, quote, 20. I stood with that for a moment. Becca said, quote, 21. She held it out. I took it. It said, Brigadier General Retired Thomas Holcomb, United States Army. Below the name, in handwritten ink, Captain Aldridge, I served with your CO at Fort Meade. I know your record. Please don't leave. I turned the card over. I read it again. Then I put it in the small bag I was carrying and said, I'm going to call someone. Give me 20 minutes. The person I called was Major Dolores Wynn, who was no longer a major, but a lieutenant colonel, retired, living in Fayetteville, North Carolina, 40 minutes from Fort Bragg, who had given me the most useful professional advice of my career in a briefing room 13 years earlier, and who had never once given me advice I did not eventually find to be correct. It was past midnight. She answered on the third ring. I gave her the situation in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The general recognized you from a photograph. Whose photograph? I said I did not know yet. She said, Find out before you go back in that room. Because if he knows your record specifically, he did not learn it tonight. She paused. What do you want the outcome to be? I said I wanted the accurate version of me to exist in that room before I left it. She said, Then go back in, but not yet. Get the full picture first. She said it the way she had always said everything, without inflection, without softening. She said, You have been underestimated by professionals with classified clearances. You can handle a wedding reception. Then she said goodnight and hung up. I called the number on the card. Brigadier General retired Thomas Holcomb answered immediately, which told me he had been waiting. His voice was the specific voice of a man who had spent decades being the person in a room who set the tone, unhurried and precise. He said, Captain Aldridge, I am glad you called. I said I appreciated the card. He said he wanted to explain himself before anything else. He said he had seen a photograph of me in uniform on the wall of a colleague's office at the Pentagon 2 years earlier, a colleague who had worked with my unit, and that my name had come up in a context he was not going to specify, but which had been entirely complimentary. He said he had not connected the name to my sister until that evening, when Davis's mother introduced him to the wedding party before the ceremony, and he had noticed my name on the program. He said he had spent the cocktail hour asking careful questions and had learned from 3 separate people that I worked for the federal government in an unspecified capacity. He said he had then asked a 4th person, a cousin of Davis's who had attended the University of South Carolina at the same time as me, who had told him I had been in ROTC and was believed to be in the Army, but that the family did not really discuss it. He said, quote, 29, quote, he paused, quote, 30, quote. I stood in the parking lot with the phone against my ear and the Charleston night around me, and I thought about what the lieutenant colonel had said. Get the full picture first. I said, quote 31? He said, of course. I said, quote 32. There was a brief pause. Then the general said, quote 33. He paused again. Quote 34. I said it was. I said I would come back inside in 10 minutes. He said he would be at the table near the east windows. I want to pause here for a moment, because what happened between that phone call and walking back through the door was not dramatic, and I want to be accurate about it. I stood in the parking lot, and I thought about the cropped photograph and the group text, and 4 years of a social media account in which I did not exist. And I thought about my mother's face when she had asked me to step outside, and I thought about the specific efficiency with which she had done it, and I understood for the first time, completely, and without the filter of wanting it to be otherwise, that this had not been about the wedding. The wedding had been the occasion. The pattern was much older than that. I had been analyzed and edited and omitted by my own family for long enough that it had become the operating assumption of everyone in that room, the furniture of their understanding of who I was. That was the full picture. And the full picture meant that walking back through that door was not about correcting a misunderstanding. It was about being present, accurately and completely, in a room that had been operating on a false version of me for years. I had everything I needed, but I hadn't told them that yet. Now I want to tell you what else Becca found, because this is the part that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about the situation. and I want to be precise about why it mattered. While I was on the phone with the general, Becca had kept pulling the thread. She had found my mother's personal social media account, which was public and had been public for 6 years. She had searched my name. In 6 years of posts documenting her family, her social life, her garden, her grandchildren when they existed, I appeared 4 times. Twice in old photographs from before I commissioned, when I was still a college student in civilian clothes. Once in a post from 2014 that said simply, "So proud of both my girls," with no further context and no photograph. And once in a post from 2019 in which my mother had responded to a comment asking about her daughters. The comment said, "You must be so proud, one a lawyer and one in the military." My mother's response said, underscore, underscore, quote underscore, 37, underscore, underscore. I need you to understand what that response actually meant. In 2019, I had completed a 14-month deployment and received a commendation I cannot describe in this context. I had been promoted to captain. I had been written up in a document that will be in a federal archive for 50 years. My mother had described this as keeping busy. Wait, it gets worse. Becca had also found, through a public post from one of Claire's bridesmaids, a screenshot of a planning document for the wedding toasts. The document had been shared in the wedding party group text I had not been added to. It listed each bridesmaid with a one-sentence description to help Davis's family understand who everyone was. The descriptions read, Megan, Claire's best friend from college. Sutton, Claire's cousin, lives in Atlanta. Priya, Claire's co-worker, very funny. Ashley, Claire's roommate from law school. For my name, the document said, Nora, Claire's older sister, works for the government. Not much to add. Not much to add. I read that sentence in the parking lot of the Riverside Club in Charleston, South Carolina, standing in a dusty rose bridesmaid dress with a retired brigadier general's card in my bag, and I want to be accurate about what happened in my chest when I read it. It was not the cold, settling feeling from before. It was something with more heat than that, more specific. The feeling that comes when you have been holding two contradictory data sets and the analysis finally completes, and you understand that one of them was never actually data, it was just what someone needed to believe. My family had looked at 13 years of service and a record that was on a wall at the Pentagon and had found not much to add. That was not an oversight. That was a conclusion they had reached deliberately and maintained carefully. Because the alternative required them to revise a story they had been telling for a long time. The general had said my CO's colleague had described me as the best analyst he had worked with in 20 years. My mother had said not much to add. One of those sentences was going to be the operating truth in that room before I left it. I texted Becca. Send me everything. All of it. Every screenshot. She sent it in 4 minutes, 19 images organized chronologically. I put my phone in my bag. I looked at the door. I thought about what the lieutenant colonel had said 13 years ago about holding two contradictory things and determining which one was true. I had been doing that my whole career. I had been doing it wrong in only one context. I had one conversation left in that room. And I had been waiting for it without knowing I was waiting, for 13 years. Everything that followed had been prepared by a pattern I had not created and could not have prevented, and what I needed to do was simply walk back through the door and be present when it resolved itself. Because I had learned in 13 years of intelligence work that the most important thing you can do when a situation is about to break open is to be in the room when it does and not anywhere else. The general was at the table by the east windows. 239 people were inside that reception who had been given one version of me. I straightened the bridesmaid dress I was wearing, which was not my preferred garment but was what I had, and I walked back through the door. The reception hall was at full volume when I walked back in, the band on the second song after the toasts, the room loose and warm, with 2 hours of open bar and the specific ease of a wedding where the ceremony has gone well and people have stopped being nervous. I stood at the entrance for a moment and read the room the way I had been trained to read rooms, not emotionally but informationally, locating the relevant parties, assessing the current state of play, identifying the variables I could not control. My mother was at the family table near the dance floor with her back to the door. She had not seen me come in. Claire and Davis were on the dance floor. Claire's eyes found me across the room, and something moved across her face that I did not interpret. I only noted it, and then she looked away. The general was at the table by the east windows, exactly where he had said he would be. A compact man in his late 60s in a dark suit, seated with two other people I did not recognize, watching the door. When he saw me, he stood up. That was the first thing anyone in that room did when I walked in. A retired brigadier general stood up. I wore the bridesmaid dress, and I walked across the reception hall toward his table, and I was aware of the specific quality of attention that follows a person who walks with a particular kind of purpose through a room that is not expecting it. I was not performing purpose. I had it. Those are different things, and rooms can tell them apart. The general shook my hand with both of his. He said, quote, 38, quote. He said it at a volume that carried to the tables nearest us, which was not an accident. He was a man who had spent decades understanding how rooms work. He introduced me to the two people with him, a former colleague from the Pentagon and that colleague's wife. And as he introduced me, he said my full name, my rank, my unit, and the words, one of the finest intelligence officers currently serving in this army. And he said it clearly and without qualification and at the same volume as before. The tables near us had gone slightly quieter. I sat down. The general's colleague leaned forward and said he believed he knew my work, not by name but by output, and that there were people in his former office who spoke about a particular analytical framework with a specific kind of respect that meant it had saved someone something significant. I said I appreciated that. I said it quietly. The room was doing its own work around me, and I did not need to assist it. My mother arrived at the table 4 minutes later. I had known she would. I had read the room correctly. She came from the direction of the family table, and she was carrying the expression she used when a situation had developed in a direction she had not planned for, and she was recalculating in real time. She looked at the general. She looked at me. She said, in her social voice, quote, 40. The general stood again when she approached, because he was that kind of man, and he said, quote, 41. He said it the way people say things they mean, rather than things they have calculated. Directly, and without softening. My mother's face did the thing faces do when a prepared response meets an unprepared situation. She said, of course. She said it to the table rather than to me. Claire appeared at my shoulder. I did not turn immediately. I finished the sentence I was in the middle of with the general's colleague, and then I turned. Claire was still in her wedding dress, and she had the specific look of someone who had been crying recently and had repaired it carefully. She said, quote, 43. I said yes. We walked to the corridor off the main hall, the same one my mother had used earlier in the evening, and stood in the quiet of it. Claire said, quote, 44, quote. I said, quote, 45, quote. She said, quote, 46, quote. I said, quote, 47, quote. She said, quote, 48, quote. She stopped. I waited. She said, quote, 49. I said, quote, 50. She looked at me for a moment. She said, quote, 51. I said, quote, 52. She said, quote, 53. I said, quote, 54. She nodded once. She looked like she was going to say something else and then did not. She went back to her reception. I stood in the corridor for about 30 seconds, and then I went back to the general's table. The room was very quiet in the specific way that a room is not actually quiet but has realigned around a new piece of information and is processing it. I could feel it in the way I could feel a shift in a briefing room when an assessment had just reordered itself. The general was talking. People at adjacent tables were listening, in the way people listen when they want to appear not to be listening. He was telling a story about an operation he could speak about in general terms, an intelligence product that had come from a small team at Fort Bragg, and he was describing the quality of analysis involved in language that was specific and professional, and that carried its own weight. He did not say my name in that part. He did not need to. The room was doing the arithmetic. My mother sat 3 tables away for the rest of the evening and did not come back to the East Windows table. At the end of the night, she found me near the coat check and said good night, and held my arm briefly and said, "I hope you had a good evening." I said I had. She looked at me for one moment, with something in her expression that was not quite an apology and not quite an acknowledgement, but was in the vicinity of both, and then she walked to the car with my father. I watched them go. I said goodbye to the general in the parking lot. He shook my hand again and said, "I meant what I said in there. Every word of it." I said I knew. He said, "For what it's worth, the people who know your work know it completely." I said that was worth quite a lot. He gave me a card with his personal email and said to reach out if I ever needed anything at all. I have not needed to reach out yet. I keep the card in the green notebook on my nightstand, which is where I keep things I want to remember are there. Becca and I drove back to the hotel at midnight. She did not say anything for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Then she said, "You know what the best part was?" I said, "What?" She said, "He stood up." She said it the way you say something that has already said everything. I said I knew. We drove the rest of the way without talking, and it was the most comfortable silence I had been in all weekend. There is one more thing I haven't told you yet. 3 weeks after the wedding, Claire sent me a text. It said, quote, 60. I read it twice. I wrote back, quote, 61. That was the entirety of the exchange. We have spoken 4 times in the year since then. Phone calls, shorter than they used to be, careful in the way of 2 people who are still working out what they are to each other, now that they cannot use the old map. I do not know what we will eventually be. I have stopped trying to predict outcomes in contexts where I do not have sufficient data. My mother has not mentioned the general or the evening in any communication since. She sent me a birthday card in February. Signed it Love. Mom. I put it in the accordion folder where I keep documents I have not yet categorized. I have not categorized it yet. I am back at Fort Bragg. I work the hours I work, and I do the work I do, and most of it I cannot describe here. On Tuesday mornings, I run 5 miles on the post trail before the briefing day starts, and I carry the green notebook in my jacket pocket, the way I have carried it for 13 years. And sometimes when I am running, I think about that parking lot in Charleston and the side door opening, and a man I had never met saying my rank and my name into the June dark, like a fact that had always been there, and simply needed someone to say it out loud. What I actually learned from all of it is not what I expected to learn. I expected to learn something about family and loyalty, and the specific cost of being erased by the people who were supposed to know you best. What I learned instead was something more precise. A false version of a person can only survive in rooms where no one has access to the true version. The moment someone with accurate information walks in, the false version cannot hold. My family had spent years carefully managing which rooms had access to which version of me. What they had not accounted for was a retired general at a Pentagon colleague's wall, looking at a photograph, filing a name. They had not accounted for the possibility that the version of me they had been suppressing was the version that existed, completely and on the record, in rooms they had no access to and no ability to edit. The green notebook from my first assignment is in a box at Fort Bragg. The first page still says what it said when I was 23 years old, the major sentence about holding 2 contradictory things and finding what is true. I have not needed to reread it in years because I know it. But I know it is there. The card from the general is in the current notebook on my nightstand. I look at it when I open to a new page, which I do every few months when the old one is full. His handwriting is very clear. Captain Aldridge, I know your record. That is the whole sentence. It is enough. If any part of this is familiar to you, I would want to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Davis's mother called my mother the week after the wedding, that conversation has an ending I did not expect and did not witness and heard about only secondhand, and it is a better ending than anything I could have arranged myself.